The sky over Zoralis Prime was a swirl of fire and fury, a violent mosaic of blazing trails stretching across the upper atmosphere. The Vel'drun, known throughout the galaxy as the apex predators, had descended upon this world with the same ruthlessness they had used to crush countless civilizations before. Their ships were sleek, lethal, their designs perfected through millennia of warfare. Tri-bladed gunships, the pride of the Vel'drun war fleet, glided soundlessly over the land, their razor-sharp hulls reflecting the hellfire they had unleashed. Their reputation was unparalleled. Conquerors of entire star systems, destroyers of empires, creatures of unparalleled ferocity. There had never been a species that could stand against them for long. Until now. As their assault on Zoralis Prime continued, the Vel'drun were met with something they had never anticipated. Resistance, but not just any resistance. A resistance unlike anything they had encountered in their violent history, and it came from a single human war form. Designation Echo 9. Beneath the vast, smoke-choked skies of Zoralis Prime, amidst the ruins of a city, already half erased by the Vel'drun's initial bombardment, Echo 9 stood alone. The ground around it was scorched, buildings crumbled, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the lingering shockwaves of energy blasts. But the warform remained, unmoved, its massive frame a dark silhouette against the flickering backdrop of destruction. Its armor, a combination of blackened titanium and exotic composite alloys, bore the marks of an unrelenting assault, dense, scorched plating, and cracks from thermonuclear explosions that had rained down on it. Yet still, it stood. The Vel'drun had surrounded it, their elite enforcers, warriors forged in the fires of countless battles, waiting for the inevitable end. In their eyes, this human warform was nothing more than a minor obstacle, a nuisance, a momentary delay before they continued their march of annihilation. They had crushed entire civilizations with ease, planets turned to ash beneath their claws. This would be no different. But as the seconds passed and the warform made no move to retreat or surrender, a whisper of doubt crept into the minds of the Vel'drun leaders. This was not fear. They did not fear. But something else. An unsettling sensation. A recognition that this human was not like the others. It was different. Something waiting. And then, it happened. The first enforcer made its move. With the speed of a predator, it charged forward, its bladed limbs extending, its jaws snapping. The others followed, their bodies moving in perfect sync, ready to overwhelm the human warform. They had fought countless species before, each time victorious. A well-coordinated assault, overwhelm the target, destroy it. Echo 9 didn't flinch. The first enforcer never had the chance to make contact. It was torn apart in an instant, its body disintegrating under the force of a kinetic blast that seemed to fold space itself. The next enforcer lunged, but it was met with the brutal precision of Echo 9's counterattack, the warform's massive arm cutting through the air in a blur, its plasma-augmented blade carving through the enforcer's energy shield like a hot knife through butter. In less than 2 seconds, it was reduced to nothing more than a cloud of smoldering scrap. The third Vel'drun was no better. It attempted to retreat, but Echo 9 was faster, its armor capable of adjusting its trajectory mid-movement, compensating for the environmental chaos around it. With a snap of its wrist, it sent a pulse of electromagnetic force that ripped through the third enforcer's energy systems, causing it to collapse in a heap, its limbs twitching helplessly. The warform didn't pause. It moved on, its glowing, blue eyes fixed on the command spire in the distance, the Vel'drun's base of operations. For the Vel'drun, this was not just a battle. It was a wake-up call. A terrifying realization that their tactics, honed over millennia, had just failed, spectacularly. The human warform, one soldier, had decimated an entire elite squad without breaking a sweat. The predators had become the prey. The Vel'drun High Council, seated aboard the dreadnought Vortex Maw, felt the weight of the moment. They were strategists, tacticians. They had conquered 74 systems, broken the backs of species that had once stood at the height of their power. Zarn assassins, Drella hive champions, even the starborn juggernauts of the Dequen solar fleets, all had bowed to Vel'drun's superiority. But humans? This was something else entirely. Commander Trexel, a towering figure whose armor bore the scars of 100 wars, had watched the footage of Echo 9's rampage on a loop. His mind raced, trying to comprehend what he had seen. The human warform's tactics were nothing like anything they had encountered before. There was no hesitation, no fear. It was not a soldier. It was a machine, yes, but one that seemed to think, to adapt, to learn. The fight was over before they had even understood it had begun. "Proceed," Trexel had ordered at last, his voice cold. He was not a being accustomed to doubt. Yet, as the order left his lips, a small, nagging voice in the back of his mind told him that this time would be different. Across the galaxy, scattered on distant worlds and aboard ships that sailed in the shadow of the stars, the Vel'drun forces began to mobilize. Echo 9's actions had stirred something they hadn't felt in centuries: uncertainty. The one thing the Vel'drun had always prided themselves on was their absolute control. Control over the battlefield, control over their enemies, control over the galaxy itself. But now, that control was slipping, and they didn't even know why. Meanwhile, on a hidden outpost within the magnetic storms of HD 189733b, a woman stood alone in a darkened room. A hologram of the Vel'drun homeworld spun lazily in. Her palm, its surface covered in intricate topographic details and strategic points. She watched the footage of Echo 9's onslaught. A smirk tugged at the corner of her mouth. "They took Chicago," she whispered under her breath. Her voice was steady, calculated, and filled with an unspoken promise. "Let's see how they handle Detroit." She wasn't just watching the battle unfold, she was orchestrating it. Echo 9 had been a part of her design. A prototype, yes, but one that had been tested in secret, honed for a day like this. For a war like this. The Vel'drun, in their hubris, had underestimated humanity. They hadn't realized that humans did not just survive. They adapted, they learned, they evolved. And when cornered, they fought not just for survival, but for vengeance. And the Vel'drun had just declared war on the deadliest species in the galaxy. The first strike was quick, swift, and brutal, a perfect execution of calculated fury. Echo 9's systems hummed with an eerie calm as it navigated the battle-scarred surface of Zeralis Prime. The warform was not just a creation of human engineering, it was the embodiment of humanity's fiercest instincts: survival, adaptability, and an unyielding drive to push forward, no matter the cost. To the Vel'drun, it was a weapon they had not anticipated. It was their first taste of something far more dangerous than any enemy they had faced before. It was humanity at its most. Primal Echo 9's objective was clear: push the invaders off Zeralis Prime and stop their advance across the galaxy. But as the warform advanced, it wasn't just engaged in a physical battle. It was participating in a conflict of ideologies, an age-old struggle between those who dominate and those who refuse to be dominated. The Vel'drun's long-held belief that they were the universe's apex predators was about to be shattered. The humans would not simply endure. They would break their chains and fight back with a ferocity the Vel'drun could not yet understand. While Echo 9 obliterated the Vel'drun's elite forces, its movements were calculated, every motion a step, toward more than just survival. The warform had been designed not just for combat, but for psychological warfare, an embodiment of humanity's defiance in the face of overwhelming odds. As the Vel'drun regrouped and planned their counterattack, they did so with a creeping sense of unease. This wasn't just about winning, it was about facing something they could not predict. Back on the Vortex Maw, the Vel'drun High Council convened, in an atmosphere heavy with tension. Commander Trexel stood before a massive holographic map of the galaxy, his sharp eyes scanning the coordinates that marked human-controlled systems. His mind was racing, piecing together the fragments of data they had gathered from their early encounters with the human warform. There was something distinctly wrong with the way humans fought. It wasn't like the battle tactics of other species. There was no pattern, no rhythm, just pure, violent innovation. "Predators know their prey," Trexel muttered, his voice almost to himself. "And we know how to break them." His mandibles clicked in agitation. "But we don't know how to break this." The Vel'drun had studied every major civilization they had conquered, deconstructing their tactics and strategies to the point of perfection. The Zarn, with their calculated strikes, The Drella, whose hive mentality made them seem as one in battle. The star-born juggernauts of the Dequen, who were powerful but predictable. The Vel'drun had learned the limits of each species, their strengths, and most importantly, their weaknesses. And every time, they had crushed them without hesitation. But with humanity, there was no weakness. Just an endless, chaotic spiral of relentless ingenuity. As the High Council deliberated, the Vel'drun fleet began to adapt. They shifted their tactics, moving away from their usual overwhelming firepower, and focusing instead on subtlety. They initiated a full-system blackout over Zeralis Prime, cutting off the warform's communications and vital systems in an attempt to disorient it. In response, Echo 9 went offline for a split second, its systems shutting down as it recalibrated, an uncanny mimicry of a vulnerable human soldier who had been forced into a momentary surrender. It was a trap. The Vel'drun moved in for the kill. What they did not expect, however, was that Echo 9 was more than just a war machine. It was a mirror of humanity's greatest strength, adaptability. The moment its systems reactivated, it did so with precision, its combat protocols enhanced by new data it had gathered from the blackout. It had learned. It had evolved. Echo 9's arm raised, not in defense, but with devastating offense. In one fluid motion, it released a barrage of nanite missiles. Tiny, yet incredibly powerful devices capable of slicing through the Vel'drun's finest armor. The missiles exploded in synchronized chaos, each one targeting a weakness the Vel'drun had never expected. A crack in their shield system, a vulnerability in their fleet's power grid. The Vel'drun fleet, once a terrifying force, was now in disarray. Their ships, magnificent in their design, were being ripped apart from the inside, their shields failing in the face of the relentless onslaught. It wasn't the sheer power of Echo 9 that was the most terrifying to them. It was the fact that, with every passing second, the warform seemed to learn from its enemies, to adapt to their strategies, and counter them with brutal efficiency. The battle raged on. The humans on the ground were just as relentless. Zeralis Prime had once been a thriving world of stunning beauty, its vast forests and expansive oceans now reduced to a battlefield of scorched earth and smoking ruins. But the humans fighting here weren't just defending their planet. They were defending their future. They weren't merely surviving, they were winning. And they were doing it together, against an enemy that had never faced anything like them. In the heart of Zeralis Prime's ruined capital, a small squad of human soldiers prepared to mount their final push against the Vel'drun's command center. Among them was Captain Mira Thompson, a seasoned officer who had seen more death than she cared to remember. She stood at the front of her unit, her eyes focused on the horizon where the Vel'drun's last remaining forces regrouped. Her soldiers, each one a survivor of the initial wave, stood beside her, their faces hard, resolute. They weren't just fighting for Zeralis Prime anymore. They were fighting for every human colony scattered across the galaxy, for every world that had ever been targeted by the Vel'drun's insatiable hunger. As she watched the skies darken with the shadows of incoming Vel'drun reinforcements, Captain Thompson didn't feel fear. What she felt was something far more dangerous: determination. It was the same feeling that had driven humanity to build ships capable of navigating the stars, to explore the farthest reaches of space, and to continue pushing forward when all seemed lost. "We fight," she whispered to herself, "because we're human." With that, the humans surged forward, their weapons blazing as they fought through the smoke and rubble, their resolve unwavering. The Vel'drun had thought they were unstoppable, but now they would learn what it truly meant to face humanity in battle. The tide had turned. The Vel'drun command structure had always been linear: domination, suppression, annihilation. For eons, it had worked flawlessly. They conquered, absorbed resources, and moved on. But now, their frontline commanders were silent. Their dreadnoughts, engineered over centuries to crush resistance, were nothing more than twisted metal adrift in orbit. The High Council's encrypted transmissions, once calm and precise, became riddled with stammering, overlapping signals, echoing the one truth they had never accounted for: the humans were not prey. As the war spread beyond Zeralis Prime, the Vel'drun scrambled to mobilize reinforcements from their nearest stronghold, the ironclad bastion world of Gorax Tel. It was a planet that had never known defeat, a crucible where the fiercest of their warriors were forged. Yet even as they launched fleets bristling with plasma lances and dark matter warheads, a strange hesitation crept in. Because the whispers had started, shared in hushed tones across comms, etched into intercepted reports. Humanity doesn't follow the rules of war. They evolve, they adapt, and worst of all, they retaliate. In orbit above the decimated remains of Vel'drun Outpost Zeta-4, a captured Vel'drun strategist, one of their highest ranking, sat confined within a human interrogation chamber. It wasn't what he had expected. There were no neural lances, no invasive telepathic prods. Just questions, endless questions, delivered by a softly spoken AI with a human cadence, paired with images of entire Vel'drun squadrons obliterated by weapons he could not understand. The images weren't shown for intimidation. They were part of an analysis. Humanity wasn't interested in breaking him. They were studying him, learning from him, dissecting his command structure, his psychological reactions, his species' limitations, and slowly, something terrifying dawned on him. Humans didn't need superiority in numbers. They didn't even need superior weapons. They needed only knowledge and time. Given enough of both, they could break any force, no matter how ancient or ruthless. They weren't fighting with raw strength. They were fighting with evolution as their weapon. He began to understand what the Vel'drun command refused to admit aloud. This wasn't just a war for territory or dominance. It was a war for the future of intelligent life in the galaxy, and humanity wasn't losing. Back on the human command ship Dauntless Resolve, Admiral Kira Malin stood before a projection of the expanding war front. She had once been a diplomat, a liaison between human colonies and alien trade partners. But the Vel'drun invasion had rewritten her destiny. Now, she was the architect of the most ambitious counteroffensive in human history. Her fleet was lean, forged not just in labs and factories, but in desperation and resilience. The warships were each a testament to human innovation, cloaked in adaptive armor that hardened on impact, armed with railguns whose ammunition could be printed mid-battle, powered by fusion cores that doubled as localized reactors for ground troops below. But even more remarkable than the hardware were the minds commanding them. The fleet's navigational AI, Velos, was a symbiotic construct, part machine, part uploaded human consciousness, capable of calculating enemy trajectories while simultaneously composing battlefield symphonies to keep pilots psychologically sharp. Human ingenuity wasn't confined to brute force. It was woven into the very essence of their war effort. On the Vel'drun side, the cracks were deepening. Their warriors, bred for conformity and fearlessness, began encountering something they had no genetic defense against: unpredictability. Human units fought in ways that defied strategic logic, disguising signals as stellar interference, deploying false surrender tactics that lured Vel'drun units into kill zones, and most baffling of all, coordinating ambushes based on behavioral analysis rather than military doctrine. Each human soldier operated with a sense of autonomy unheard of in most galactic militaries. It wasn't chaos, it was organized disobedience, each deviation pushing them further from the static playbook the Vel'drun depended on. Worse still were the whispers filtering through Vel'drun ranks of an emergent pattern, a terrifying possibility, that Echo 9 was not the only war form, that humanity had more, that this was not the apex of their development, but only the beginning. And indeed, across the Sol system, in bunkers carved beneath Europa's glacial crust and deep within Mars' hollowed-out mountains, new prototypes were already being tested, units designed for atmospheric stealth, zero-gravity combat, and psychic warfare. War forms that didn't just fight the enemy, they adapted with them. Data from Echo 9's battlefield experiences was being fed directly into neural cores of the newer models, each one born smarter, faster, and deadlier than the last. One such prototype, codenamed ARC-E7, was still in simulation chambers. But even there, its capabilities stunned its creators. It could predict enemy decision trees before the first shot was fired. It could forge alliances mid-battle using real-time socio-linguistic mapping of hostile forces. In one test run, it halted a simulated uprising not with violence, but by rewriting its opponent's command logic mid-combat. The next generation of human warforms would not simply defeat their enemies. They would make war itself obsolete by becoming its final evolution. The Vel'drun, for all their military might, were stuck in a paradigm that had remained unchanged for millennia. Humanity, on the other hand, had never had a paradigm to begin with. They were chaos incarnate, minds of flesh and machine, driven by a hunger to survive that not even extinction events could quell. They were the only species that had stared into the void, imagined something greater, and built toward it with blood, steel, and stubbornness. The war was no longer about strategy. It was about identity. The Vel'drun had believed themselves to be the apex for too long. But the apex was not a position. It was a process. And in that process, no one could outmatch the species that turned adversity into evolution. The turning point came not with a single battle, but with a shift in philosophy, one that no other species had ever dared to embrace. Humanity, faced with an enemy built on structure, hierarchy, and calculated domination, chose instead to embrace uncertainty. Where the Vel'drun waged war through rigid protocols and honor-bound doctrine, humans evolved their strategy into something far more elusive: fluid warfare. An art form sculpted by creativity, improvisation, and sheer willpower. It wasn't that humans ignored the rules of engagement. They simply bent them, rewrote them, and turned them into weapons. It began with the deployment of phantom nodes, cloaked micro-relays no larger than a beetle, scattered across contested star systems. These devices were invisible to traditional sensors and operated using quantum entanglement to transmit data without latency. With them, human fleets no longer relied on centralized command. They became decentralized swarms, capable of autonomous coordination, like cells in a living organism. An entire strike group could split into dozens of independent units, vanish into asteroid fields, and reassemble behind enemy lines, all while remaining undetectable. The Vel'drun simply could not comprehend it. Their tactical maps, once clean and organized, were now chaos incarnate. When they deployed response fleets to reinforce faltering systems, they often found only decoys, fake signal flares, hollow ships broadcasting falsified life signs, or derelict vessels loaded with EMP mines. On more than one occasion, entire Vel'drun regiments were tricked into engaging holographic fleets, while the real human force bypassed them entirely, striking at their war factories, depots, and command cores with surgical precision. The battlefield had become a stage, and humanity were the playwrights, choreographing every step the enemy would take before they took it. The psychological toll was even greater. Vel'drun warriors, bred in hives, conditioned from hatching to obey, began suffering breakdowns when faced with foes who fought without patterns. Human soldiers didn't always follow orders. Sometimes they acted out of instinct, sometimes out of rage, and sometimes they broke protocol simply to save a fallen comrade or destroy an enemy in a way that made no tactical sense, until it worked. This unpredictability shattered the Vel'drun's confidence. In their culture, disobedience meant weakness. But in humanity's war doctrine, it was often the very spark of genius. Nowhere was this more evident than during the siege of Karl Tess, a Vel'drun stronghold encased in crystalline basalt, orbiting a collapsed neutron star. It was thought impenetrable, its surface guarded by gravity shears and orbital mine belts. Yet somehow, a human spec ops team known as the Nulls breached it. They didn't arrive in a ship. They arrived inside asteroids, burrowed into hollowed-out rock, powered down, and drifting with the debris field. They spent 13 days in complete silence, relying on muscle memory and suit-integrated meditation protocols to endure the vacuum. And when they struck, they did so with unrelenting precision. In under 20 minutes, they disabled the station's fusion grid, broadcasted subharmonic panic signals across the Vel'drun's neural comms, and triggered a cascading series of internal detonations that tore Karl Tess apart from the inside. The Vel'drun command's response was to accuse each other of sabotage. They simply couldn't believe such a thing had come from humans, not because it was technologically impossible, but because it was illogical. Who would risk such a reckless insertion? Who would endure such agony just for a chance to destabilize a single fortress? Humans would. Behind the scenes, Earth's strategic command had undergone a metamorphosis. War was no longer directed solely by admirals or generals. It was now curated by polymath collectives, each composed of military historians, behavioral psychologists, futurists, and even game theorists. They studied not only the enemy's weapon systems, but their mythology, their humor, their ancient tales of glory and shame. It was total warfare, but waged through an understanding of culture as much as kinetics. They would ask questions like, what symbol does the enemy fear? What superstition haunts their dreams? And then, those answers would become part of the human arsenal. On the field, combat units were integrated with TAC Muse, an adaptive neural assistant that could adjust a soldier's tactics based on their emotional state, current health, terrain conditions, and real-time predictive analysis. It wasn't just AI, it was intuition codified. TAC Muse learned not only from a soldier's past missions, but from the collective experience of every war zone across the galaxy, and it did not always recommend combat. Sometimes it suggested misdirection. Sometimes it guided a unit into enemy territory not to fight, but to sing, activating sonic pulses known to disrupt Vel'drun's sensory cohesion. This blurred the lines between warfare and performance art. One field report described a human unit conducting a ghost march through a Vel'drun-occupied city, moving only under moonlight, leaving behind strange glyphs, flickering light pulses, and silence. No weapons. No contact. Just dread. Within days, the Vel'drun abandoned the city, convinced they were being hunted by something supernatural. They didn't realize they were the prey of a psychology unit, trained not to kill, but to unravel their belief in victory. The galactic community, still too frightened to join the fight, watched with growing awe. At first, they had feared humanity's rise. Now, they began to see something else. Not conquerors, but rewriters. The humans weren't just winning, they were redefining what war could be. The old ways were crumbling. The age of brute force, empires and top-down command hierarchies was ending. In its place was something new, something organic, unpredictable, and terrifyingly effective. The Vel'drun, once seen as eternal predators, now fought with hesitation. They began sending envoys to fringe colonies, seeking alliances. They offered technology, resources, even territory. But the memory of their atrocities lingered, and their desperation only deepened the irony. They had sought to erase humanity, and now they were begging for mercy from the very species they had underestimated. And back on Earth, in a silent chamber beneath the Antarctic ice array, a prototype war form, Archie-7, opened its eyes for the first time. Not with rage, not with hatred, but with curiosity. It was not the clash of titans that everyone had expected. When the final battle came, it was not the gleaming starships and missile barrages that made history. It was something far simpler, far more profound. In the heart of the Vel'drun homeworld, where once the ground had been a place of military grandeur and conqueror's pride, it was now a field of ruin, the air thick with a sense of impending fate. The Vel'drun had learned to fear humanity, but now, at the precipice of their destruction, they faced something that terrified them far more than the prospect of defeat. An evolution of humanity that they couldn't comprehend. Their warriors, once the galaxy's most feared, stood on the edge of a precipice not of steel and fire, but of identity. Humanity had not just adapted to war, they had transcended it. Earth's final weapon, Archie-7, had been designed in the deepest secrecy, a synthesis of human ingenuity and artificial intelligence. It was not a warship. It was a being, a living machine, with the ability to think, to feel, to evolve. Born from the ashes of the human-Vel'drun conflict, Archie-7 was both a symbol and a harbinger. To the Vel'drun, it was a nightmare made flesh. To humanity, it was a promise of what they could become. Archie-7's first step onto the battlefield was like the slow, inevitable ticking of a clock in the death chamber. It moved with a quiet grace, its chrome exoskeleton reflecting the dying light of the burning sky. Its design was organic yet mechanical, an unsettling blend of biomechanical beauty. For every person who saw it, it seemed to whisper of possibilities, of an intelligence that defied all laws, of a being that was both machine and man. But for the Vel'drun, it was not a promise, it was a warning. Archie-7 did not fight with brute force. It fought with something far more dangerous, knowledge. It had access to every moment of the war, every tactic, every movement, every decision made by both sides. The Vel'drun commanders, trained to adapt to enemy strategies, quickly realized that they were not facing a soldier. They were facing a master strategist who could predict their every move before they made it. Archie 7 could read the terrain, the battle lines, even the emotions of its enemies with terrifying precision. And yet, what terrified the Vel'drun most was its ability to evolve mid-fight, to change its tactics on the fly, faster than any of their best generals could. It was here, on the crumbling surface of Vel'drun's capital, that the true nature of the human spirit revealed itself. The final confrontation began not with explosions or the clash of weapons, but with an unexpected silence. The battlefield was eerily still, the air heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The Vel'drun had expected a final decisive charge, the kind of climactic battle that defined wars throughout history. Instead, Archie 7 stood motionless, its sensors scanning the environment with an unsettling calm. Its creators had programmed it with the understanding that victory could sometimes be more than just defeat. Victory, it knew, was a balance of force and compassion, strategy and mercy. The Vel'drun, desperate and unsure, launched their final assault. Massive warships descended from the sky, firing their energy beams in a relentless barrage. It was a show of strength, meant to cow the humans into submission. But Archie 7 did not flinch. Instead, it listened. It understood the rhythms of battle, but it also understood the emotions tied to it. The fear, the desperation, the hubris of the Vel'drun. And it exploited that understanding. With a flick of its hand, it sent out pulses that disabled the Vel'drun's communication systems, leaving their forces blind, scattered, and vulnerable. It wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a lesson. Archie 7 wasn't just fighting for victory. It was teaching. The Vel'drun commanders screamed in rage, but their commands fell on deaf ears. The once proud warriors found themselves outmatched, not just in firepower, but in will. Humanity had broken them not by the power of their weapons, but by the power of their ideas. What the Vel'drun had once thought of as an inferior species was now wielding an intellectual and emotional edge that made their vast fleet seem obsolete. But Archie 7 wasn't just about strategy. It was about understanding the psychology of war. Every action, every strike, was an invitation to the Vel'drun to look into the mirror of their own choices. It wasn't victory that Archie 7 wanted, it was understanding. The final blow came not as a weapon fired, but as an idea planted deep in the hearts of the Vel'drun. As their fleets faltered and their armies crumbled, the realization hit them, like a storm. They had been led to this moment by arrogance and underestimation. They had fought humanity as if it were a simple, predictable enemy. But humanity was never that. Humans were chaos and reason, brutality and mercy, all at once. They could destroy, but they could also build. They could be ruthless, but they could also show mercy. And in that realization, the Vel'drun began to break. The leader of the Vel'drun forces, once a proud conqueror, knelt before Archie 7, not out of respect, but out of sheer exhaustion. It was not a bow of surrender, but of recognition. Humanity had not just won a war, they had reshaped the very foundation of what war meant. The Vel'drun no longer feared death. They feared the idea of irrelevance. They feared being left behind by a species that had evolved beyond them, not through technology, but through the ability to adapt, to think, to feel, and to grow. Archie 7 stood silently as the Vel'drun commander spoke, but its voice was not one of triumph. It was one of warning. "This is not the end," it said, its voice a calm whisper amidst the wreckage. "Humanity has changed the rules, and now all others must change with it, or fall." As the last of the Vel'drun fleet retreated, humanity stood victorious, not because they had defeated their enemies, but because they had forced their enemies to face themselves. In the years that followed, the galaxy would never be the same. The Vel'drun, now humbled and forever altered by their encounter with humanity, would cease their expansion, retreating into their own territories, forever mindful of the unpredictable force that had risen to challenge them. And humanity? They had only just begun to realize the full extent of what they had become. The war had reshaped them, but it had also forged something more, something far greater than even the most advanced warships and weapons could define. They had become the future, the architects of a new era where war, peace, and civilization would all coexist in ways that no one had ever imagined. And in this new age, the name of humanity would not be feared alone. It would be revered, for now the galaxy was left to ponder. What does a predator become when it learns that it no longer reigns supreme? The answer, they would soon learn, was as unpredictable as the humans themselves. As we close this chapter, leave a like if you've enjoyed this saga of war, triumph, and rebirth. Share your thoughts on humanity's role in the universe, and let us know how you would have faced the Vel'drun's challenge. What would you have done in the face of annihilation?